Good morning. This is Story Starters for younger kids, and I will be reading parts of books that are appropriate for kids ages about 4 to 8. There you can see the ones who are watching. Of course, youngers can listen, olders can listen. This book is called Mrs. Piggle. This is a book that will be listened to. This has a lot of words and not a whole lot of pictures. This book is available at the Dubuque County Libraries as a downloadable. I have to use my very own copy to show you this book. This again is it's very appropriate for young children to hear, but it's going to be too difficult for them to read themselves. Next week, I will have one that is more of a first-time reader that kids who are learning to read can do it. So chapter 1 of Mrs. Piggle by Betty MacDonald. There's a whole bunch of these Mrs. Piggle books. This one is my favorite. After a while, they tend to be kind of silly, but if your kid loves them, then there's something to keep on reading. Mrs. Piggle herself, chapter 1. There she is. I expect I might as well begin by telling you all about Mrs. Piggle so that whenever I mention her name, which I do very often in this book, you will not interrupt and say, "Who is Mrs. Piggle? What's she look like? How big is she? How old is she? What color is her hair? Is her hair long? Does she wear high heels? Does she have any children? Is there a Mr. Piggle?" Mrs. Piggle lives here in our town. She is very small and has a hump on her back. When children ask her about the hump, she says, "Oh, that's a big lump of magic. Sometimes it turns me into a witch, and other times into a dwarf or a fairy. And on special occasions, it makes me into a queen." The children are all very envious of the hump because besides being magic, it is such a convenient, fascinating place for wings. Mrs. Piggle has brown, sparkly eyes and brown hair, which she keeps very long, almost to her knees, so the children can comb it. She usually wears it on top of her head in a knot, unless someone has been combing it, and then she has braids, or long curls, or hair just hanging, or with a jewel on top. One day I saw her digging in her garden wearing a crown with her hair billowing down her back. She waved and said, "I promised Betsy," Betsy is one of her children friends, "I promised Betsy that I would not touch this hair until she came back from school," and she went on her digging. Mrs. Piggle's skin is a goldy brown, and she has a warm, spicy, sugary cookie smell that is very comforting to children who are sad about something. Her clothes are all brown, and they never look crisp and pressed because they are used for dress up. She wears felt hats, which the children poke and twist into witch's hat and pirate's hat, and she does not mind this at all. Sunday mornings, she takes one of the hats off the closet shelf, gives it a few thumps, pulls it down on her forehead, and wears it to church. She wears very high heels all the time, and she is glad to let the little girls borrow them. Mrs. Piggle has no family at all. She says that her husband, Mr. Piggle, was a pirate, and after he had buried all of his treasure in the backyard, he died. She just has herself and Wag, her dog, and Lightfoot, her cat. The most remarkable thing about Mrs. Piggle is her house, which is upside down. It is a little brown house, and sitting there in its tangly garden, it looks like a small brown puppy lying on its back with his feet stuck up in the air. Mrs. Piggle says that when she was a little girl, she used to lie in bed and gaze up at the ceiling and wonder what it'd be like if the house was upside down. So when she grew up, she built her own house that way, just to see. The bathroom, the kitchen, and the staircase are right side up. They are more convenient that way. You can easily see that you could not cook on an upside down stove, or wash dishes in an upside down sink, or walk up upside down stairs. In the living room of her house is a large chandelier, and instead of being on the ceiling, it's on the floor. Of course, it is really on the ceiling, but the ceiling is the floor, and so it is the floor, and the children turn on the lights and then squat around it pretending it's campfire. Mrs. Piggle says that the chandelier is the only one in town which is put to any real use. Her bedrooms all have slidey boards in them because if you look up at your attic ceiling, you will see that a slanty ceiling, when turned upside down, makes a fine slide. Also, all the wall lights are very close to the floor, and that makes it handy for small children. For the first 10 years after the house was built, Mrs. Piggle climbed in and out of her rooms over the high doorway, but now she has little steps, which are just the right things to practice jumping. Nobody knows how old Mrs. Piggle is. She says she doesn't know herself. She says, "What difference does it make how old I am? I'm never going to get any bigger." Mrs. Piggle's dog, Wag, has puppies every once in a while, and so she keeps a long list of names of children who want them. And for Lightfoot's kittens, she has a long waiting list on the blackboard in the dining room. Mrs. Piggle backyard is full of big holes where small boys dig for Mr. Piggle's treasure. And her front yard is full of flowers, which the little girls pick and put into vases. Every child in town is a friend of Mrs. Piggle, and she knows very few of their parents. She says grown-ups make her nervous. For the first year after she built her house, Mrs. Piggle lived there all by herself, except for Wag and Lightfoot, and she was very lonely. Then, one dark, rainy afternoon, when she was baking sugar cookies and thinking how fun it would be if she knew someone else, she happened to look out of her kitchen, and there, coming up the street, carrying a big suitcase, was a little girl. Mrs. Piggle wiped the flour off her hands and hurried right out into the rain and invited the little girl in for tea. The little girl's name was Mary Lou Robertson, and she was 8 years old and very fat, and she was running away from home. She told Mrs. Piggle all this after she had had 3 cups of tea and eaten 7 sugar cookies. She said, "I'm running away from home because I hate to wash the dishes. All I do is wash the dishes. I'm just like a servant. Dishes, dishes, dishes. Wash, dry, put away. That's all I do. My mother doesn't love me at all. She isn't my real mother anyway. She probably got me out of an orphanage just so I would wash her dishes." Mary Lou began to cry again, so that after the 8th sugar cookie, she ate it. Mrs. Piggle said, "What do you mean she isn't your real mother?" Mary Lou said, "No, she says she is, but no real mother would make you wash the dishes." "Wash the dishes, huh? Now, that's a funny thing," said Mrs. Piggle. "I mean, you hating to wash dishes so much, because you see, I like to wash dishes. In fact, I enjoy washing dishes so much that it makes me very sad to see that only dishes I wash for are for me and Wag and Lightfoot. 3 or 4 dishes a meal, that's all. When I wash dishes, Mary Lou, I pretend that I'm a beautiful princess with long gold curly hair." Mary Lou's hair was black and braided into 2 stiff little pigtails. "With apple blossom skin and forget-me-not blue eyes, I pretend I've been captured by a wicked witch, and my only chance to get free is to wash every single dish and have the whole kitchen sparkly clean before the clock strikes. For when the clock strikes, the witch will come back and inspect, and if there is even a little crumb anywhere, if there are pots and pans are wet, or if the silverware has been thrown in the drawer wet, or if the sink has not been wiped out, the witch will have me in her power for another year." Mrs. Piggle looked at the clock and jumped up. "It's 10 minutes to 4, Princess, and we have much to do. Hurry, hurry, hurry." So Mary Lou also jumped up and began carrying the tea things to the sink. And Mrs. Piggle whisked them in and out of the dishwasher, and Mary Lou dried them, and Mrs. Piggle hurried as fast as she could and put the cookie things away. And every once in a while she would stop and say, "Hark, Princess, do you hear the thump of the witch's big gnarly cane?" Then Mary Lou, her braids bobbing up and down with excitement, would say, "I hear it, Princess. It is coming closer and closer." Soon the kitchen sparkled, and the dishes were washed and dried and put away, and every crumb had been swept off the floor. Mary Lou even curled Lightfoot's tail neatly around her legs and smoothed Wag's fur. Just before the clock struck, Mrs. Piggle said to Mary Lou, "Princess, I must leave you now, but show the witch your work, and oh, I do hope you will be freed." Then Mrs. Piggle went upstairs, and pretty soon Down the stairs came a terrible old witch with a long black dress and a tall black hat and a big gnarly black cane. Mary Lou was very scared until she saw the sparkly eyes of Mrs. Piggle under that black hat. She showed the witch the kitchen, and the witch took out the cookie pans and carried them over to the light to see if they were clean and dry. She got down on her knees, squeaking like a rusty gate, to see if Mary Lou had swept under the stove. She felt inside the teacups to see if there was sugar in the bottom, and she put on her glasses to examine the sink. She could not find anything wrong, so she handed Mary Lou the key to the kitchen door and screeched out, "You are free, princess, but I will get you again, never fear." The witch clumped back up the stairs, and in a few minutes down came Mrs. Piggle again. "Well," said Mrs. Piggle, "do you see why I like to wash the dishes?" Mary Lou said, "Oh, Mrs. Piggle, that was the most fun I've ever had." Mrs. Piggle said, "Of course, you can have more fun than I can, because you have so many more dishes to wash than I do. If I only had more dishes and could take longer, I would be a princess with curly yellow long hair, apple blossom skin, and blue eyes, and a beautiful voice, and I would sing sad songs over the dishpan. Also, if I had more dishes, I would have the witch ride through the night on a broomstick, and I would creep out on the back porch to see if she was coming. I could hear her land with a thump on the roof, and I would slip upstairs to see if she was going to slide down the chimney or thump down the stairs. Or there would be ever so many exciting things to pretend, if only I had more dishes to wash." After a while, it stopped raining and the sun came out, and Mary Lou took her suitcase and went home. That night, her mother, it really was her mother, almost fainted when she came out of the kitchen exactly 27 minutes after dinner, and Mary Lou was sweeping the floor, and all the dishes were washed and dried and put away, and everything was immaculate. Mrs. Robertson rushed in and called Mary Lou's father, and he came to the kitchen and pretended to fall on the floor with surprise, and then said to Mary Lou's mother, "I like your new maid, madam. In fact, she is so much better than Tilly Slopwash, who used to be here, that I think we should invite her to be the moving picture show sometime early in the evening." Then Mary Lou told them all about Mrs. Piggle, and Mary Lou's mother said, "Oh, yes, I remember seeing that odd little house. She sounds like a charming friend, and if you are certain that she invited you, you may go over there after school tomorrow." The next day after school, Mary Lou went to see Mrs. Piggle. She took her best friend, Kitty Wheeling, with her, and Mrs. Piggle was very glad to see them and showed them through her upside-down house and served tea and cookies. Kitty said, her mouth full of cookie, "My worst trouble is making the bed. I can't get them to smooth. I'd much rather wash dishes like Mary Lou, but Mother won't let me change jobs with my sister, who washes the dishes, until I've learned how to make the beds properly. Oh, I just despise making beds." Mrs. Piggle poured herself another cup of tea, gave a saucer of cream to Lightfoot and 4 cookies to Wag, and then said, "If you think you had a hard time making beds, Kitty, imagine how hard it is for me. You see, the cruel queen sleeps in my bed every night and inspects them every morning, and if she finds a single wrinkle, even one as big as a pin, she'll have me thrown into the dungeon. Come upstairs and I'll show you how to make beds." This is getting kind of long. Should I keep going? I'll keep going. They went upstairs, and Mrs. Piggle threw the covers off the foot of one of her own beds, and then she had Kitty help her make it, and when they finished, it was as smooth as the floor, no wrinkles. Mrs. Piggle said, "The secret is to throw the covers way back. You simply cannot smooth up a bed, because if you do, there might be a wrinkle down by the foot, and of course the cruel queen will find it, and then down to the dungeon you go." Mrs. Piggle took the bed all apart and said, "Now, Kitty, you and Mary Lou make the bed while I tell the cruel queen you are ready for inspection." She went into the closet and shut the door. When she came out, just as Kitty and Mary Lou finished the bed, she was no longer Mrs. Piggle, but the wicked, haughty, cruel queen. On her head, she wore a glittering jeweled crown. Her hair hung down her back. Around her shoulders, she had a purple fur-trimmed robe, and on her face she wore a smile so mean it made Kitty's teeth chatter. She stalked over to the bed and lay down. With her gold slippers, she felt the bottom of the bed. With her ring fingers, she felt the top and the sides. She stood up, and with her scepter, she pulled back the spread to see if the pillows were wrinkled. Everything was perfect. The cruel queen's face became convulsed with fury. She yelled, "Not a wrinkle, not a lump. I am furious, but never fear, little slaves. My day will come, and into the dungeon you will go. Come, my servants, we will go." Mrs. Piggle stalked into the closet. That was the beginning of Mrs. Piggle Wiggle's friendship with the children. The next day, Mary Lou and Kitty's little brother Bobby and Bobby's friend Dickie went to Mrs. Piggle Wiggle's house for tea. And the next day they came and brought someone else. And pretty soon, every single child in town had been or was going to Mrs. Piggle Wiggle's house. She showed Bobby how to sneak out and get the fireplace logged without being caught by Indians. She showed Dickie how a lawnmower is really a magic machine that mows down the enemy millions and billions at a time. She taught Max how to take out the ashes without making a sound, without leaving a trace, to show the other train robbers who were on his trail that he and the sheriff had camped there that night. Mrs. Piggle Wiggle certainly knew how to make work fun, and she also knew that there were certain kinds of work that children love to do, even though they do not know very well how to do it, like painting and ironing and cooking and carpentry. One day at Mrs. Piggle Wiggle's, there were two little girls baking cookies. One little boy baking a pie and getting flour on the floor and eating most of the dough. A little girl was ironing all of Mrs. Piggle Wiggle's clean clothes. Four boys were painting with paint on their faces, was chopping kindling. Two boys were painting the doghouse. Three girls were darning old pirate socks. And Mrs. Piggle Wiggle's of Mr. Piggle Wiggle's socks. Pirates were everywhere, digging in the backyard and shooting and yelling and running around. Mrs. Piggle Wiggle was sitting on the corner of the living room sewing on doll clothes. She was wearing the crown, and Kitty Wheeling was standing beside her throne, which was a chair with a tablecloth, dipping her hairbrush in a glass of water and making Mrs. Piggle Wiggle's hair into long, wet curls. Kitty said, "Your Highness, shall I use the gold or the silver hairpins?" Mrs. Piggle Wiggle said, "Oh, let's use the ones with the diamonds in them. They look better with the crown." Just then the telephone rang, and it was some mother wanting to know what to do with her little girl who wouldn't take a bath. And that is how Mrs. Piggle Wiggle got started with her wonderful cures. She told Hubert's mother about the won't pick up toys cure, and Patsy's mother about the radish cure, and Alan's mother about the slow eater tiny bite taker cure. Anne and Joan's mother was told about the fighter quarrelers cure. Dickie's mother was about the selfish boy cure. Mary's mother about the answer backer cure. And Bobby and Larry and Susan's mother about the never want to go to bed cure. And that is the end of chapter 1. That was a very long one, but the book is a fun one to read, to have your mommy or your daddy or your grandma read, because it's all kinds of funny stories that Mrs. Piggle Wiggle does with children. Thanks for coming today and staying through that very long story. It's a hard one to listen to, but thanks for trying. And I will see you next time. The next time we read, it will be a shorter book. Thanks for coming. Bye-bye.